On July 30th, 2009, Nigerian security forces surrounded a compound in Maiduguri, Borno State, and killed Mohammed Yusuf, the founder of the movement the world would come to know as Boko Haram. He was killed in police custody after his capture, extrajudicially, on camera. The footage exists. The Nigerian government announced that the threat had been eliminated. 13 months later, Boko Haram carried out its first suicide bombing. Within 3 years, it was holding territory. Within 5 years, it had declared a caliphate. Within a decade, it had killed more than 35,000 Nigerians, displaced over 2 million, and spawned a successor organization, Islamic State West Africa, province that is still expanding today. The threat had not been eliminated. It had been accelerated. But here is the question that should have been asked in 2009 and has never been fully answered since. Where did Mohammed Yusuf come from? Not physically, we know he was from Borno State, but intellectually, institutionally, ideologically, what ecosystem produced him? What infrastructure made his argument not just thinkable, but persuasive enough that thousands of young men were willing to die for it? Because if you can answer that question, you find something that changes everything about how Nigeria understands its own security crisis. Mohammed Yusuf did not emerge from a vacuum. He emerged from an ideological environment that had been deliberately constructed across northern Nigeria over 2 decades. An environment shaped, institutionalized, and financially sustained by the very political project that 12 Nigerian governors launched in 1999 in the name of justice, morality, and Islamic governance. The question in the title of this investigation is whether Sharia law accidentally created Boko Haram. By the end of this video, you will have enough evidence to decide whether the word accidentally belongs in that sentence at all. If you are new here, subscribe before we go further. This channel exists to deliver the analysis mainstream Nigerian media won't touch. It gets deeper from here. To answer this question properly, you have to start before Boko Haram. You have to start before 1999. You have to start with what northern Nigeria looked like, institutionally, educationally, theologically, in the decade before 12 governors stood up and announced that God's law would now govern their states. Northern Nigeria in the 1980s and 1990s was experiencing a theological transformation that most of the country and most of the world was not paying sufficient attention to. The Islam that had historically dominated northern Nigeria was Sufi Islam, primarily the Tijaniya and Qadiriya orders. This is a tradition rooted in the Sokoto Caliphate of Usman Dan Fodio, established in the early 19th century after a jihad that was itself a reform movement, but a reform movement that produced a sophisticated, hierarchical, institutionally embedded form of Islamic governance that was distinctly West African in its character. Sufi Islam in northern Nigeria venerated scholars and saints, organized social life through networks of spiritual brotherhood, and accommodated a degree of local cultural practice that more scripturally rigid Islam would consider impermissible. Into this tradition, from the late 1970s onward, came the Izala movement, the Society for the Removal of Innovation and Re-establishment of the Sunnah. Founded in Jos in 1978, funded, documented, and traceable with Saudi institutional money. Theologically committed to Wahhabism, the austere, literalist, anti-Sufi interpretation of Sunni Islam that is the official theology of the Saudi state. Izala's project was explicit. Remove what it called bid'ah, religious innovation, from northern Nigerian Islam. That meant attacking Sufi saint veneration as idolatry. That meant challenging the authority of Sufi sheikhs and emirs whose legitimacy rested on Sufi theological credentials. That meant building a parallel educational, institutional, and mosque infrastructure that competed directly with the Sufi establishment and that was better funded because it had Riyadh behind it. By the 1990s, the theological landscape of northern Nigeria had visibly shifted. A generation of northern Nigerian Muslims, particularly young, urban and educated men, had been formed in the Izala Wahhabi framework rather than the Sufi one. Their Islam was more scripturally literal, more suspicious of the existing Islamic authority structure, more politically assertive, and more hostile to the Nigerian secular state as a legitimate governance institution. This is the generation that was in their 20s and 30s when the 12 governors announced Sharia in 1999. And this is the generation from which Mohammed Yusuf drew his earliest followers. Now, let us trace Mohammed Yusuf precisely, because precision matters here and vague connections are not enough. Mohammed Yusuf was born in 1970 in Yobe State. His early religious formation happened within the Salafi Wahhabi intellectual environment that Izala and Saudi-linked institutions had built in northern Nigeria. He studied under Sheikh Jafar Adam, one of the most prominent Salafi scholars in northern Nigeria, himself educated in Medina University on a Saudi scholarship, himself a former associate of Yusuf before their public falling out. Jafar Adam is a critical figure in this story. He represented the mainstream of Saudi-influenced northern Nigerian Salafi scholarship, theologically Wahhabi, institutionally embedded in the Sharia establishment, politically willing to work within the framework of the Nigerian state, even while criticizing its secular dimensions. He was, in the language of this investigation, political Sharia's intellectual class, the scholars whose Saudi-formed credentials gave the Governor Sharia project its theological legitimacy. Yusuf started in that world. He preached in Maiduguri mosques that were part of the Salafi network. He was recognized as a scholar of ability within that community. And then gradually, he moved to a position that the mainstream Salafi establishment, including Jafar Adam, considered dangerously extreme. His break was not over theology in the abstract. It was over the Nigerian state. The mainstream Salafi position, as represented by Adam and others, was that Muslims could engage with Nigerian state institutions, could work in government, attend state schools, participate in the constitutional system, while working to Islamize those institutions from within. Political Sharia was the expression of this position. Use the democratic system to implement Islamic governance. Take the governorships, pass the laws, build the courts, reform from inside. Yusuf rejected this entirely. His position was that the Nigerian state was fundamentally haram, forbidden, that its constitution was a Western imposition incompatible with authentic Islamic governance, that its educational system, Western in its epistemological foundations, was not just inadequate, but spiritually dangerous, that any Muslim who worked within the Nigerian state's institutions was compromising their faith. Boko Haram, whose name in Hausa means roughly Western education is forbidden, was the institutional expression of that rejection. Now, here is what the mainstream analysis always misses. Yusuf's critique of political Sharia was not that Sharia had gone too far. It was that political Sharia was a fraud, that the governors who implemented it were hypocrites who sent their children to Western universities while amputating the hands of poor people for stealing food, that the scholars who gave those governors Islamic legitimacy were court clerics who had sold their theological integrity for state salaries, that the entire project of working within Nigerian constitutional democracy to implement Islamic governance was a contradiction in terms, because a system rooted in Western constitutional principles could not be genuinely Islamized. It had to be replaced. This critique resonated. Among young men who had watched the Sharia promise be made in 1999 and had seen by 2002 and 2003 that the poverty had not lifted, that the justice had not materialized, that the same political class that had always exploited them was now doing it in the name of God, Yusuf's argument that political Sharia was betrayal, not governance, was not extremism. It was the lived experience of the Sharia states narrated in theological language. Boko Haram is not the opposite of political Sharia. It is political Sharia's most honest critic, radicalized into violence by the gap between what was promised and what was delivered. Now, let us map the institutional connections with precision, because this is where the investigation must be most careful and most specific. The geographic overlap between Sharia state Hisbah recruitment and early Boko Haram membership is not incidental. It is concentrated and documentable. In Borno State, the epicenter of Boko Haram's founding and growth, the Hisbah was established under the Sharia framework adopted in 2000. Like Hisbah forces across other states, it drew from the same pool of unemployed, undereducated, economically marginalized young men that the Sharia project had promised to uplift and had failed to. Men who had been recruited into a religiously authorized enforcement role, given institutional authority without institutional accountability, paid poverty wages for work that put them in daily confrontation with the populations they were supposed to serve, and given no pathway to economic advancement beyond their Hisbah position. When Yusuf began preaching in Maiduguri in the early 2000s, he was preaching in precisely those communities, to precisely those men. His message that the system that had recruited them, underpaid them, and delivered nothing to their families was not just politically corrupt, but theologically illegitimate, landed in prepared ground. The madrasa geography is equally specific. The Saudi-funded religious schools that had been operating across Borno, Yobe, and Bauchi since the 1980s and 1990s educated students in a framework that was theologically incompatible with Nigerian civic identity. Not because Islamic education is inherently incompatible with Nigerian citizenship, it is not, but because the specific Wahhabi theological content of those schools positioned the Nigerian federal state as a foreign imposition, Western education as spiritual contamination, and constitutional democracy as a system designed by non-Muslims to keep Muslims from authentic self-governance.
Students who completed that educational formation were not equipped to be Nigerian citizens in the full constitutional sense. They were equipped to be members of an Islamic Ummah whose primary institutional loyalty ran to a transnational religious identity rather than to the Nigerian federal state. For most of them, this created no crisis. They navigated both identities without violence. But for those whose economic desperation, personal experience of state violence, and encounter with Yusuf's preaching aligned in the same moment, the framework was already there. The argument had already been made. The conclusion was already available. Jafar Adam, the mainstream Salafi scholar who had been Yusuf's teacher and then his most prominent critic, understood this danger. He publicly denounced Yusuf's extremism. He tried to pull the young men who were gravitating towards Yusuf back into the mainstream Salafi framework. He argued on theological grounds that Yusuf's rejection of the Nigerian state was not supported by authentic Islamic jurisprudence. On April 13, 2007, Jafar Adam was shot dead during Fajr prayers in his mosque in Kano. The killing has never been conclusively solved, but the timing, as Yusuf's movement was consolidating and as the mainstream Salafi establishment's efforts to contain him were intensifying, is a data point that serious investigators have never been able to fully dismiss. The most prominent internal Islamic voice against Yusuf's radicalization was silenced. 2 years later, the Nigerian security forces killed Yusuf himself extrajudicially. The movement had lost its founder and its most credible internal critic within 2 years. What remained was an organization without the theological moderating influence of either, and it became, in the years that followed, progressively more violent, more apocalyptic, and more impervious to internal reform. Now, let us examine the institutional response to the 2009 Maiduguri uprising, because how the Nigerian state responded tells you as much as anything that came before. The Nigerian Joint Task Force's response to the 2009 Maiduguri uprising was militarily effective in the short term and strategically catastrophic in the long term. Yusuf was captured, handed to police and killed in custody. Hundreds of his followers were killed. His compound was destroyed. The Nigerian government declared victory. What the response did not do was examine a single one of the institutional conditions that had produced the movement. The Hisbah networks that had served as recruitment pools were not examined. The madrassa system that had educated a generation outside Nigerian civic formation was not investigated. The foreign funding pipelines that had built the ideological infrastructure were not traced. The political economy of the Sharia states, the poverty, the unemployment, the governance vacuum that Yusuf's argument had fed on was not addressed. The governors whose political Sharia project had created the conditions of betrayal and disillusionment that Yusuf had narrated into theological justification for violence were not asked any questions.
Instead of the Nigerian government treating 2009 as a law enforcement problem that had been solved by a law enforcement response, kill the leader, disperse the followers, declare victory. Mohammed Yusuf had a lieutenant named Abubakar Shekau. By 2010, Shekau had reconstituted the organization. By 2011, it was bombing the United Nations headquarters in Abuja. By 2012, it was conducting coordinated military attacks on Nigerian army formations. By 2014, it had abducted 276 schoolgirls from Chibok in Borno State in Tualu. An act that brought global attention to a crisis the Nigerian government had been mischaracterizing as contained for 5 years. The 2009 response did not eliminate Boko Haram. It removed the one figure, Mohammed Yusuf himself, who had maintained enough theological authority over the movement to potentially negotiate with it, who had enough personal credibility with its members to potentially pull it back from the precipice of full insurgency. His extrajudicial killing destroyed that possibility and handed the movement to a successor who had no interest in negotiation and no theological restraint on violence. The Nigerian state did not accidentally create Boko Haram, but it did accidentally ensure that Boko Haram became unstoppable. Now, let us look squarely at the institutional question that this investigation is building toward. The Sharia expansion of 1999 created 5 specific institutional conditions that directly enabled Boko Haram's emergence and growth. Not as a matter of theological analysis, as a matter of institutional and political mechanics. The first condition was the legitimacy crisis of political Sharia itself. By 2002 and 3, the promises of 1999 had not been kept. The poverty had not lifted. The justice had not materialized. The zakat commissions were collecting and not distributing. The Hisbah was arresting poor people while governors flew abroad for medical care. The gap between what was promised, God's law applied equally to all, delivering justice and dignity, and what was delivered, a parallel enforcement system that prosecuted the poor and protected the powerful, was visible, documented, and felt in the daily lives of the people it had been promised to. Yusuf's argument that political Sharia was a fraud was not extremist propaganda. It was an accurate description of the evidence available to anyone living in a Sharia state in 2003. The legitimacy crisis of political Sharia did not cause Boko Haram, but it created the audience for Yusuf's message, a population that had believed the promise, watched it be broken, and was ready to hear someone explain why. The second condition was the Hisbah recruitment infrastructure. The Hisbah forces across the 12 states drew from precisely the demographic that insurgencies draw from: young, male, economically marginalized, undereducated, without formal employment prospects, and a grievance framework that made their marginalization feel like injustice rather than misfortune.
The Hisbah gave this population an institutional identity, a uniform, a language of religious authority, and a daily practice of confrontation with state power. It also paid them poverty wages, offered no advancement pathway, and surrounded them with the visible evidence that the political class they were enforcing the law for was not subject to any of the laws they enforced. When Yusuf preached to Hisbah members and former Hisbah members in Maiduguri, he was preaching to people who were already institutionally formed in the language of Islamic enforcement, already experienced the betrayal of political Sharia firsthand, and already had the organizational habits, hierarchy, collective action, religious identity as the primary loyalty that an insurgency requires. The third condition was the educational infrastructure. The Saudi-funded madrassa system that had been operating across Borno, Yobe, and Bauchi educated a generation outside Nigerian civic formation. Students who completed that formation knew Islamic jurisprudence and knew it well. What they did not know, what they had not been taught, was Nigerian constitutional history, Nigerian civic rights, Nigerian national identity as a framework that could compete with or complement their Islamic identity. The Nigerian state, in the same states, had allowed its public school system to collapse through underfunding and neglect. The result was a generation for whom the madrasa was not a supplement to Nigerian civic education, but a replacement for it. Yusuf's argument that Western education was forbidden resonated most powerfully with young men for whom Western education in the form of functional Nigerian public schools had never been genuinely available. The abstraction he condemned was not an abstraction. It was the specific experience of a Nigerian state that had failed to show up in their communities with any alternative to the madrasa.
The fourth condition was the security vacuum. The collapse of formal governance in the Sharia states, the underfunded police, the dysfunctional courts, the absent social services, created the physical and institutional space that insurgencies require. Boko Haram did not hold territory in Lagos or Port Harcourt or Ibadan. It held territory in the states where the Nigerian state had the least institutional presence and the least governance capacity. That was not a coincidence of geography. It was a predictable outcome of 25 years of governance substituted by religious performance. The fifth condition was the response to the 2009 uprising. The extrajudicial killing of Yusuf, the mass killings of his followers, the complete absence of any institutional investigation into the conditions that had produced the movement, each of these generated its own recruitment logic. Young men whose fathers, brothers, and community members had been killed in 2009 did not need Wahhabi theology to explain why they joined Boko Haram in 2010 and 2011. They needed a vehicle for revenge. Boko Haram provided one, and the ideological infrastructure that 2 decades of political Sharia and Saudi-funded madrasa education had built provided the theological language that made revenge feel like justice. Now, let us address the counter-arguments with the seriousness they deserve. The strongest counter-argument is the most obvious one. Correlation is not causation. Sharia was adopted in 12 states. Boko Haram emerged primarily in Borno, Yobe, and Bauchi, 3 of those 12, but not all 12. If Sharia created Boko Haram, why did it not create equivalent insurgencies in Kano, Sokoto, or Zamfara? This is a genuine analytical challenge, and it must be taken seriously. The answer has 3 parts. First, Borno, Yobe, and Bauchi share specific geographic and demographic characteristics that the other Sharia states do not. Proximity to Lake Chad Basin, historical connection to the Kanuri ethnic identity that cuts across national borders with Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, and a specific colonial administrative history that left these states with weaker Nigerian federal institutional presence than the more historically centralized emirates of Kano and Sokoto. The insurgency did not emerge randomly from the 12 Sharia states. It emerged from the 3 where the Nigerian state's institutional presence was weakest and where the governance vacuum was most severe. Second, Boko Haram did recruit from other Sharia states and from non-Sharia states. The insurgency's geographic concentration in the northeast reflects its operational base, not its full extent of recruitment. Fighters from Kano, Kaduna, and Sokoto have been documented in Boko Haram and ISWAP ranks. Third, the argument is not that Sharia mechanically produced Boko Haram in every state where it was adopted. The argument is that Sharia created a set of institutional conditions, the legitimacy crisis, the Hisbah recruitment infrastructure, the madrassa educational displacement, the governance vacuum that made Boko Haram's emergence possible and its growth rapid. Those conditions were present in varying degrees across all 12 states. They were most acute, most concentrated, and most aligned with specific triggering factors in the northeast. The second counter-argument: Boko Haram would have emerged anyway. Political Islam's violent expressions are a global phenomenon. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Al-Shabaab. Nigeria was not immune. The specific features of Sharia in Nigeria are not necessary to explain the outcome that is observed across multiple countries and contexts. The global trend is the context. The local institution is the catalyst. The third counter-argument: poverty caused Boko Haram, not Sharia. Young men with economic opportunities do not join insurgencies. The solution is development, not theological analysis. Poverty is a necessary condition for insurgency recruitment. It is not sufficient. Al-Qaeda's founding leadership was educated and economically comfortable. ISIS drew fighters from European middle-class Muslim communities. The relationship between poverty and insurgency is real, but it runs through ideology, through a framework that converts economic grievance into theological justification for violence. In northern Nigeria, that framework was built in the institutions that political Sharia and Saudi funding constructed. Remove the poverty without removing the ideological infrastructure, and you reduce recruitment. Remove the ideological infrastructure without addressing poverty, and you also reduce recruitment. The two are not alternatives, they are simultaneous requirements. Treating only one while ignoring the other is what Nigeria has been doing since 2009. The 3 biggest misconceptions. The first: Boko Haram has nothing to do with Sharia. It hijacked the religion. Boko Haram did not hijack Sharia. It was produced by the same ideological ecosystem that Sharia mobilized and then failed to satisfy. It is not the opposite of political Sharia. It is political Sharia's most radicalized critique, the argument that political Sharia was a fraud taken to its violent conclusion. The second: the Nigerian military has solved the Boko Haram problem. It has not. ISWAP, Islamic State West Africa Province, split from Boko Haram in 2016, killed Shekau in 2021, and has since consolidated control of large areas of the Lake Chad Basin. It has better discipline, better ideology management, and better community relations than Boko Haram ever achieved. The military has degraded Boko Haram. It has not addressed the institutional conditions that produced it and that are currently producing ISWAP. The third: this problem is located in the northeast and does not affect the rest of Nigeria. ISWAP's stated goal is a caliphate that encompasses the entire northern Nigeria. Its expansion trajectory is southward and westward. Its recruitment draws from across northern Nigeria. Its financing increasingly involves sophisticated criminality, kidnapping for ransom, cattle rustling, taxation of farming communities, that has economic tentacles across the Middle Belt. The geographic containment narrative is the Nigerian government's preferred story. The evidence tells a different one. Drop a comment right now. Before the strategic outlook, do you think Nigeria has ever genuinely confronted the institutional causes of Boko Haram, or has it only ever treated the symptoms? Tell me below.
The reform attempts after 2009 are themselves evidence of the institutional diagnosis. The Buhari administration's military escalation from 2015 onward successfully degraded Boko Haram's operational capacity in northeastern Nigeria. The multinational Joint Task Force, Nigeria, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon achieved significant territorial recovery. These are real military achievements that must be acknowledged. What the military escalation did not do, and was never designed to do, was address the Hisbah recruitment infrastructure, the madrassa educational system, the Zakat Commission accountability gap, the governance vacuum in Sharia states, or the foreign funding pipelines that built the ideological ecosystem. The military treated the insurgency as an external threat to be defeated rather than as a domestic institutional failure to be reformed. The de-radicalization program, Operation Safe Corridor, was established to rehabilitate and reintegrate former Boko Haram fighters. Its record is mixed. Some graduates have returned to communities and rebuilt productive lives. Others have returned to the insurgency. The program addresses individual combatants. It does not address the institutional environment those combatants will return to. The same governance vacuum, the same unemployment, the same madrassa-educated community with the same ideological framework, the same political Sharia structure that delivered the same nothing. The educational response has been the most consistent failure. The out-of-school children crisis in northern Nigeria, 10 million children, the largest concentration for any subnational region globally, has received sustained international attention and domestic policy acknowledgement for over a decade. Dedicated programs, UBEC funding, state education budgets, international NGO investment. The number has not meaningfully declined because the structural incentives that keep children out of state schools and in madrasa systems, the theological framework that positions Western education as spiritually dangerous, the economic incentive for families to send children to free Saudi-funded schools rather than fee-charging state schools, the political incentive for governors to fund Islamic institutions rather than state schools, remain completely intact.
Where does this go from here? ISWAP is the most immediate indicator. Its 2025 expansion in the Lake Chad Basin, including documented territorial gains in Borno and increased operational activity in Yobe, represents the second generation of the insurgency operating in the same institutional environment that produced the first. Watch for ISWAP's southward movement toward Adamawa and Taraba states, which would represent a geographical escalation beyond its historical base. Watch for any evidence of ISWAP establishing governance structures, taxation, dispute resolution, service delivery in areas it controls, which is the indicator that it has moved from insurgency to proto-state. That transition is the most dangerous possible development, and it runs through exactly the same governance vacuum that political Sharia created and has never filled. From the Nigerian government, watch for whether the 2025 and 2026 security budgets allocate any resources to the institutional reform question, the madrassa regulation, the Hisbah accountability, the Zakat Commission audit, or whether they allocate exclusively to military operations. The budget is the most honest indicator of whether any administration has genuinely diagnosed the problem or is still treating symptoms. From the international community, watch for whether any of Nigeria's counter-terrorism partners, the United States, the United Kingdom, the European Union, begin conditioning security assistance on institutional reform rather than purely military metrics. That conditionality, if it ever comes, would be the external pressure most likely to force the Nigerian government to address the institutional question it has spent 15 years avoiding. The 5-year trajectory, if nothing changes, ISWAP consolidates its Lake Chad Basin position, expands southward, and begins establishing proto-state governance in areas it controls. The out-of-school children crisis produces another cohort of young men formed outside Nigerian civic identity and available for recruitment.
The Sharia states continue delivering political performance rather than governance. The institutional conditions that produced Boko Haram continue producing its successors. The 5-year trajectory, if the institutional question is addressed, it requires simultaneously regulating foreign religious financing, reforming the madrasa system without destroying it, creating genuine economic alternatives for the demographic that insurgencies recruit from, and holding Sharia state governors accountable for governance outcomes rather than religious performance. It requires a Nigerian federal government willing to spend political capital with its northern coalition partners. It requires northern Nigerian political leaders willing to tell their populations that the promise of 1999 was a fraud and that genuine development requires genuine governance. It requires exactly the kind of political courage that the evidence of the last 25 years suggests the Nigerian political class does not possess. So, here is the answer to the question this investigation opened with. Did Sharia law accidentally create Boko Haram? Here is what the evidence says. Sharia law, as practiced in Nigeria's 12 states, created 5 specific institutional conditions: the legitimacy crisis of broken promises, the Hisbah recruitment infrastructure, the madrasa educational displacement, the governance vacuum, and the security response that eliminated the one moderating voice capable of pulling the movement back from violence, that made Boko Haram's emergence possible, its growth rapid, and its suppression incomplete.
None of those conditions were accidental. They were the predictable outcomes of a political project that used religion to avoid governance, that built institutions designed to serve their architects rather than their populations, that accepted foreign funding that built ideological infrastructure outside the Nigerian state's civic framework, and that treated every consequence of these choices as someone else's problem to solve. The word accidentally in the title of this investigation deserves scrutiny. Accidental implies that the people who built this system did not know what they were building. But by 2002, it was visible that the Sharia promise was not being kept. By 2003, the disillusionment in Sharia state populations was documented. By 2005, Yusuf's preaching in my degree was known to Nigerian security services. By 2007, the assassination of Jafar Adam, the most prominent internal voice of moderation, had removed the most credible check on Yusuf's radicalization. The system that produced Boko Haram was not building towards an unknown destination. The destination was becoming visible years before the 2009 uprising. And the Nigerian political class, at every level, chose to look away. The 12 governors who launched Sharia in 1999 did not intend to create Boko Haram, but they built the conditions that made it inevitable. The Nigerian federal government did not intend to accelerate the insurgency in 2009, but it chose the response most likely to do so. The Saudi institutions that funded the madrasa system did not intend to train Boko Haram's ideological recruits, but they built the framework that made the training possible. Accidental requires that nobody could have seen it coming. The evidence says that many people saw it coming, and the people with the power to change the trajectory chose, for reasons of political convenience, personal enrichment, and foreign policy calculation, not to. That is not an accident. That is a choice. And choices have authors. Here's my question for the comments, and I want you to be specific. If you had to name the single decision, one moment, one choice, one institutional failure that most directly enabled Boko Haram to become what it became, what would it be? The 1999 Sharia expansion? The extrajudicial killing of Mohammed Yusuf in 2009, the Saudi madrasa funding that went unregulated for 40 years, the governance failure that broke the promise to northern Nigeria's poor. One decision. Drop it below. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one person who needs to understand what is really happening in Nigeria. Like, subscribe,
and I will see you in the next one.